Good morning, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak of the Populist Patriot. And today I'm going to have a very special guest. We're going to be talking for a little bit. We have TQ or Tuan Nguyen, and he is running for the Florida U.S. Senate seat as an independent candidate. Welcome to the show, TQ.
Good morning, David, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning. So one day I was kind of poking around Facebook, which is where I get my news from a variety of different articles. I subscribe to a whole bunch of different political Facebook pages of varying opinions, and I came across this post by TQ where he talked about how the threat of Russia and China, both authoritarian expansionist dictatorships that threaten the United States, on how he is deeply concerned by the rise of those two particular superpowers, economically and especially militarily. And I'm like, wow, because he TQ has always pointed out the threat posed by Moscow and Beijing. And not too long ago, we had many presidents and many political candidates on both sides of the aisle that like to say, well, the Cold War is over and China's becoming capitalist, don't you see, in free market. And Putin, well, he really doesn't have any fealty towards the Soviet ideology because he's a Christian and a nationalist and my goodness, he's somebody we can work with, don't you know? Well, there are more and more voices on both sides of the aisle, including independents like TQ, that are like, not so fast. So we're going to interview TQ and we're going to talk about his views, particularly on national security. And we're going to talk a little bit about also his campaign as well as his positions on other issues like immigration, economy, and education. So, TQ, when you look at when we take a look at your biography, you experienced firsthand the oppression of Marxism-Leninism in communist Vietnam. So taking that as a starting point, how did your political worldviews become crystallized? How did they form as a result of your background in living and growing up in Vietnam, a Marxist-Leninist tyranny, and then going to the five continents, as you point out on your website? What did you see in Vietnam? What led you down this political path to be a forceful advocate for human rights and a strong national security in the United States?
Thank you for the question, Nevin. So first of all, I want to point out we, as Americans, we are very blessed to live in a country where basic human rights are respected. But still, a large part of Americans still do not know really, and we take it for granted. The experience living under a communist regime will let people understand deeply, more than any textbook, any research that you could provide. When I was a teenager, I was held by the police just for half a day. Just that half the day had transformed myself. I had saw thing, atrocity that any movie I have seen talking about communism, about the Nazis and everything, it just still pale compared to what I witnessed on that day. So I really understand. And that day, it seemed to me, I grew up by 10 years old, even though I was a teenager at that point. I start to understand their nature of brutality. And growing up with that, I keep watching, observing, because it would be safer to shut up and don't even mention anything. But then of course, you cannot just help your belief without verifying. And over the years, I think the West, US and European as well, we have miscalculated. And we have misconception about Russia and China. Look, we always thought that, oh, let them open up economically and eventually they would open up politically. That has not happened. We reached out to into China in 1979. Look what happened. They become with Xi Jinping, he become more and more, assertive, more authoritarian. Putin, the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, we got about 10 years roughly when there was Boris Yeltsin in power. But when Putin got in, he started to think, look at the world differently. So that is in their mindset, and we, the West, U.S. and the West, has made a mistake by thinking that they will change. They open up their lifestyle, their incomes, everything, they're gonna change, and it has not. And that where we need to remind ourselves that has not been changing.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better myself. And, I'm encouraged to hear more and more individuals, political candidates in the political world that are starting to actually realize that. But you've realized this all along. Before it was in fashion to say, oh, Putin bad and China bad. And, it was thankfully Trump that really changed the discussion about China. And one of the positive accomplishments, dare I say, about Trump, for whatever the reasons, is now he's gotten more and more Americans, and very belatedly, at least on the surface, the Republican Party, to say free trade with China has not worked out because communist China is a totalitarian expansionist power that threatens the security of the United States and even the peace of the world. And now with the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, now people more and more are realizing that Russia really wants to reestablish the Soviet Union in some form or another. Now, with that stated, you even have some voices that tended not to take the Russian threat as seriously as now they're changing their minds a little bit. In some cases, like Cigar and Jetty, who is one of the co-hosts on this political YouTube channel called Breaking Points, and he has issued kind of sort of a mea culpa. Even President George W. Bush years ago, where he said, well, I could look at Putin in his eyes and I see my soul. Well, President George W. Bush in recent years, long ago, wrote that, look, I was wrong about Putin. So now more and more voices are getting to that point, which is good. So TQ, when exactly did you see Russia being a threat? When did you first see Putin specifically as a threat? Did you see it recently, or did you see it back immediately in 1999 when he became the president of Russia?
That's a very good question. First of all, I want to go back to one point you just mentioned there. It is very normal for Americans to think, even including President George W. Bush, because we think we're buddy with them. But the problem we have is because most Americans have not experienced what it's like to live under a communist regime, under a dictatorship. So that is a very normal reaction, very normal way of thinking. The only people who live under, it doesn't have to be long. You have to suffer under the regime for a period of time. You start to understand their mindset. Now go back to when do I start to see, first of all, let's remind our viewer that Putin was director of KGB, the former KGB, with now they changed to FSB, whatever it is. So of course, up to that point, at 39 years old, he was the main guy who was responsible to see all the counterintelligence and all the security against the West. That was his mindset. Of course, when there was that 8 year that was Boris Yeltsin, that was a kind of thaw, I would say, but that's not what he wants. And he started to build his, not only his career, his power, but his plan for the renewed Soviet Empire. The most recent, I want to bring back a concept of perception of weakness and strength. This go back to 1962 of the Cuban during the Cuban Missile. This is the playbook of Soviet Union and Russia. Whenever they perceive there's a weakness in America or in American president, they would they would play up their cards. Even though we go back in time, 1962, the amount of nuclear weapon we have is way more than Russia or than Soviet Union, but still they put the missile there in Cuba, and they forced us to retreat. We had to remove the missile defense from Turkey. So it wasn't purely it wasn't any accomplishment on our part. It was intended. And if you notice over time, except during the Clinton, which I might go back later if we have time, the most recent was in 2012 when Obama made a red light threat to Syria if they use the chemical weapon again. In August 2013, they did. They did use it again. Even EU, UN confirmed it. French President François Hollande, he went all the way to DC and he told Obama that French military is ready. We're waiting for your green light. And Obama backed down. So that moment, just 6 months after that, Putin came into invade and annex Crimea. So whenever that is something you can follow and detect. When you show a weakness, then that's when they're gonna act. And that the most recent. I hope I don't want to go back in time, but 2012 is the moment, and then 2014, we all know Crimea become annexed by Russia. And let's talk a little bit about China too, not only just Putin. In 1960s and 1996, when Taiwan held the first democratic election, they launched so many missile into the Taiwan Strait. Clinton, the only democratic president in our modern day, he sent 2 aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait, and that is in a way it's a show of strength, and China saw that and they backed down. So remember, whenever we show, even though our forces are the same, but we show to China or Russia we are weak, they're gonna step up. They're gonna play up the ante. So go back in time to your question. Yes, the most recent was in 2012 when we make a mistake. And of course, last year, withdrawing from Afghanistan by President Biden didn't help either. That's where Putin saw, okay, this man is a man of weakness. Let me play it.
Well, yes, Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the fashion it was, the way it was undertaken was an absolute disaster, in my opinion, at least. I think there's no question about that. Now, looping this forward, so we see weakness under Obama vis-a-vis the Russian Federation and also China too as well. We see in 2012, Obama and the Democratic-led Senate passed the New START Treaty, which, of course, every ballistic missile treaty, nuclear weapons treaty that was signed by the Soviets and then the Russian Federations were constantly violated or worked around for the betterment of Moscow. We take a look with how Obama and virtually all of the Democrats and all of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate and many in the House passed permanent normal trade relations with the Russian Federation too, including the critics of Putin that all of a sudden found God and say, oh my God, Putin is a threat. Well, they supported the New START Treaty, or most of them voted, with the exception of people like Bernie Sanders on the left, and on the right, you have the late Congressman Walter Jones from North Carolina, who's now deceased. Most of them said, hey, let's do big trade with Russia and let's have them dump cheap steel in the American market or more oil in the American market and everything. And now we see weakness is never looked upon well by Moscow and Beijing or any other totalitarian expansionist power. There's no question about it. However, let's take it forward. Let's take a look at what President Biden is doing vis-a-vis Putin's aggression in Ukraine. Moving forward, what would you advocate for policy-wise, even bills that you would co-sponsor or sponsor if you won the election as U.S. Senator from Florida? What would you advocate and what would you sponsor in the Senate regarding neutralizing Russia's power and, if possible, assisting Ukraine? What would you do different than Joe Biden, or what would you do the same?
First of all, even though for me, Biden, he did show some weakness. However, I do applaud him for reaffirm the alliance with NATO. I think that's where he really scored a point. As I mentioned in my proposed foreign policies, we need to make sure to strengthen our alliance with NATO and other partners in Asia as well, because that is something they don't have. Look, Russia is very powerful militarily, China economically and militarily, but do they have a true ally? No. And that we have to make sure we only have the upper hand, because we have historically we have the European, Australia, and eventually have some countries in Asia like Japan and South Korea. So that is something they do not have, and we have to to exploit it our best advantage. So that I do applying for him, and that had to be continued. But as for along that line, we cannot allow our business. We should not encourage us to do business with them, assuming that everything will be normal. Remember, in those countries, even the worker, their employee, they don't have the same condition, basic minimum condition requirement for safety, for human rights concern, everything like us. So they can pay very cheap labor. In China, for example, a lot of tire, for a car are made in China by prisoners. How much do they pay? Maybe they work for free. How do American workers compete in such situation? So yes, we do business. But we have to make sure you have to respect a certain norm. Otherwise, we cannot compete, and we only, we tacitly allow them to continue their human rights violations. So foreign policy, our allies, we have to make sure we shake hands with them tight. And only those countries that have sharing our Americans' value, then we will lower free trade or lower the tariffs or whatever. But for countries who always look to undermine our influence, no, we have to be, keep them at an arm's length to make sure that they will not take advantage. Remember, we, as a capitalist economy, we look for, we are driven by profit, but then it's not a quite capitalist. It's still state-oriented or socialist-oriented capitalist. So everything they do, they have national security in their mindsets, and they look to undermine it, to cheat and everything, as you have pointed out earlier.
Absolutely.
So any treaty, any trade, they have to make sure there are I would say three categories. There's a people who are neutral. There's a adversary, and I classify Russia, China belong to that club. And there's our friends and allies. So there are three groups. And according to our relation, how much they engage in our American values, then we're going to accord more favor, more benefit to those countries. Yes.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. These are not normal. Well, I don't want to say they're not normal countries, because we have no grudge against the people of China and Russia and other communist or other types of authoritarian anti-American governments. However, these are not normal governments governed by normal people that you and I would understand as normal individuals of goodwill and good faith. Trade and capitalism is weaponized, has long been weaponized by expansionist fascist countries during the era of the Great Depression, as well as communist countries, starting with the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And they used techniques of dumping cheap goods into capitalist markets. And there are several purposes in mind. Number one, it causes mass unemployment because American or Western European or East Asian workers cannot compete against that in the advanced economies with social democratic protections. You can't. You can't compete against that kind of thing. Secondly, when it causes unemployment, then you have radical leftists will say, well, this is all the fault of the capitalists because it's these big capitalist companies which allowed this to happen, and Walmart and other major multinational corporations in Wall Street are getting fat off of this sort of profiteering, and they blame capitalism. Not entirely, in my opinion, without reason, by the way. And then three, this kind of trade is also an avenue where Moscow and Beijing can gain additional hard currency. They can get additional technology to beef up their military industrial complex. And furthermore, when you trade with capitalist countries in the free world, capitalist corporations are going to they're going to chase after profit. As one presentation that used to be on Chinascope.org, which really dissects what's going on in the Communist Party of China, they call it the greed war. See, Marx and especially Lenin and his successors in the Soviet Union and other communist countries, they know that one of the Achilles heels, weaknesses of communist country or capitalist economies is their greed. And with the advent of the 1980s in the United States, Reaganomics, et cetera, this whole notion that greed is good, that our culture has become permeated with that. So Moscow and Beijing are going to run to the bank, all the way to the bank, laughing and saying, hey, we're going to trade with you. Major corporations are going to be like, hey, the heck with the country. Profit is everything that's important. And these major corporations are going to say, hey, we want more trade with Russia and China. We don't want tariffs. We don't want export controls. We don't want import quotas. We don't want any of that. And these people with white skin and American passports and American citizenship, they're going to be the biggest advocates for Moscow, Beijing, Hanoi, Havana, Caracas, Tehran, etc. You name your totalitarian dictatorship, American capitalists will be running forward. I mean, take a situation close to home for you, TQ. Back in the 1990s, and I remember this, I was actually disgusted by it. You had American businesses that were just chomping at the bit to get into the Vietnamese market so they can produce goods for cheap labor. And even the Vietnamese business press even said, well, we got reservoirs of cheap labor. And American companies were chopping off the bits and saying, well, Vietnam is reforming, they want our goods, they want our trade, and don't worry about the POW MIA issue, who cares, let's shove that under the rug. Who cares about political prisoners that were in the re-education camps and everything? And they were doing that during the Cold War in the 70s. I found articles, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce by 1978 was like, oh boy, let's get into the Vietnamese market. This is what's going on. And this leads me to my next question. With big capitalists, and we on the show have no beef with capitalism as a mode of production and ownership. But when you have the major capitalists controlling the political process disproportionately to that of the people and the national security of the United States, do you see a problem with that, and then a need for some sort of lobbying and campaign finance reform where you need to have a rebalancing of power between the competing interests of national security, trade, and representing the interests of the people? What do you have to say about that?
That is the real reality, as I mentioned earlier, because we are driven by profit. China, Russia, they are driven by national security. So those are the very two optics. It's good. Capitalism is good. I'm not saying it's bad, because thanks to that, we are more prosperous. We are more advanced than them on many fronts. But we cannot just turn blind eye and assume everything will be business as usual with those countries. This is very concerning. So we cannot take the same approach they do. We just need to be aware. That's how my policy, my proposed policies, we need to divide into different groups and how we deal with them. We have to keep in mind those countries always look to undermine our influence at every turn. Any chance they could, they will. And by doing that, we need to have some treaty. Let me point out one example. There's a TPP. Uh, People from different sides, proponent and opponent have some reason. But I want to point out the case. I was opposed to the TPP when it dealt with Vietnam. I see there's a need to have a block of free trade among countries sharing the same value to counter China influence. But from what documentation that I happen to read, Vietnam was part of that club. I mean, TPP would have been a club, but a lot of conditions regarding union, worker, and human rights, everything like that. They always claim, "Oh, we are not there yet. Give us time." So that TPP would have given them 20 years to be compliant to the requirement of all the member states. And for me, we should never allow such a thing. If you're a member of that club, everyone should be treated as equal. There's no such a thing that, oh, we're going to waive that condition to you, because they will not allow independent worker, to strike and things like that. That will be for them, because back to Poland in the 80s, right? What we saw with the worker organization that end up toppling the regime, the communist regime. And Vietnam is well aware of that and very, very concerned about that. So any sort of allowing formation of independent union and things like that, no, they won't allow. But that's why in the Senate, that's where the only chamber that have the power to ratify any treaty with foreign nation. We have to keep an eye on that. First of all, anyone join any group, any forum, everyone has to be treated equally. There's no such a thing as give you a waiver. And that's how we indirectly we can sort them out. Okay, you belong to this one, which category in my mind, and that's how we should proceed. Our market, capitalist driven profit, it has to be there, because look, if anything, without profit, people are not encouraged. We are not motivated to produce more, to come up with more creativity, and I think that it has to be there. But we have been lacking for the last 40, 30 years. We're lacking the aspect to put some sort of agreement framework in order to prevent such things from happening.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better. I think what we need and what we advocate on this program is a balance between the needs of the working class, national security, and profit. And one of the many positive aspects of true free enterprise, of true capitalism, is competition keeps businesses accountable, especially in the many sectors where competition actually works. There's no question in our minds on this program about that. And regarding the TPP, I was opposed to the TPP. I am for a degree of trade within allied countries. But when you include a communist country like Vietnam, despite certain territorial issues between Vietnam and China, Vietnam and China and Vietnam and Russia are very close. And even according to published statements, as late as within not even the past few years, between the CCP and the Vietnamese Communist Party, they talk about the convergence of strategic interests. And when you decode words like that and common goals they talk about between Xi Jinping and then his predecessor, Hu Jintao, the general secretaries of the Communist Party of China, they all talk about the common goals and the common path, and they talk about strategic goals. Vietnam and Russia, they have strategic agreements. The Vietnamese are still close with the Cubans and the Venezuelans and have military cooperation with them. The fact of the matter is despite the disagreements, when it comes down to it, from my standpoint, they're still aiming their guns, their ultimate long-range goals against the United States and its allies, one way or another. I mean, and we have to proceed with that path. Look what happened when we thought we could split China from the Soviet Union. Well, China was still working with the Soviets and their allies during the so-called split. I document that in my latest book, Turning the Page, Volume 1. I talk about that. And the fact of the matter is as much as splits can happen, they can be healed easily. And that's what happened when Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping met in Beijing in 1989, right around the Tiananmen Square massacre. So, Vietnam, regarding Vietnam reforming, I'm very familiar with that. Yes, Vietnam said they would reform the state-owned sectors and whatnot. Well, China said the same thing when we gave them PNTR in the year 2000. And well, now the state sector has gotten even bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And private enterprise, just like in Vietnam, is controlled by the party, by the ruling parties behind the scenes. So the fact of the matter is, you can never trust a communist or any other expansionist totalitarian regime to keep their word. No. It's like Jeffrey Dahmer saying he's going vegetarian. That just isn't happening. So I wanted you to comment because you have a lot of people, you have people, the so-called tankies, hardline communists here in the United States. They'll say, for example, well, communism is not so bad. Look, they're modernizing things and everything. They have the free healthcare and they are exporting products and creating all this technology and this and that and everything else, free education, universal, blah, blah, blah. They're wonderful. That Cuba's a paradise. You mentioned that you grew up in communism, under a communist dictatorship in Vietnam. And whatever you're comfortable with saying, because I know I've known people personally who grew up in communist countries, and in some ways they're traumatized by the experience. It's the best way to describe them. Whatever you're comfortable with discussing, what is it really like to live in a communist country? Describe it, please.
Okay, there's one thing people who never been exposed enough to such a regime and just look from the outward, it's expanding, it's become modernized. Yes, that is true. Why? Thanks to our dollars. And you were right by pointing out Russia, China, and Vietnam, they're all in the same gang. Even though there was a split between the Soviet Union and China, but they are not against their way of dictatorship. They are just compete to vie for who will be the big brother in the communist world, either China or Russia or Soviet Union. It's not about, let's forget about communism. We have to be clear about that. They only vie for the top position. I am the one who calls the shot in the communist world. That was it. You're right about Vietnam, about they put prisoner in conscience and everything. That too. I want to point that out. The U.S. back even during the Vietnam War, we always want to use South Vietnam at that time as a blockade containment of China, and now we try to do the same thing with the communist Vietnam. But remember, it's still a communist country. I want to point out one example. About for the last decade or so, people the Vietnamese people who protested and called out for more, political openness, they also put in jail. But those who call against China annexion, invasion, or take up of their island, and everything, will be punished with a heavier sentence. So in Vietnam, you go against China, it's a bigger crime than you go against the government. That example. So that you go back and count the number of people who get arrested on the street to protest. You protest the communist regime of Vietnam, it's a lesser, still heavy sentence, 10 years, but the other one might be more than that. That to tell what? Don't dream about it. Don't dream about that Vietnam will become, like we're going to use them to counter China. But we would not close the door on that. We should let Vietnam make the choice. You want to side with us or you want to side with China? I give you, all the opportunity to be with us, even gradually, embrace our American values and be with us. But we can now they play the card. If you don't give me all the benefit I'm asking for, I'm gonna side with China. That's how they're playing. And for years, for decades, the U.S. administration have fallen to their traps. Now back to your example, what it's like to live under communist regime. Now it is much better than when I'm talking about Vietnam. Much better than compared to decades before. Before, even I wanted to have a birthday party for myself, a teenager. If I gathering more than 10 people, I would need a permit for gathering 10 kids to come over to my party. I go to my uncle's house, which is I would say 3 miles away, to sleep over. I would need a permit for my local police that tonight I will be absent from my home. I will go to my uncle. And when I arrive at his home, he had to bring me to his local police station and say, "Oh, tonight I have my nephew came over and sleep in my place." This is how control it works. People would say, "Oh, this is it's absurd," but that's what happened. I lived through it. Now it is getting much better, much better. I have to admit that, but it's not the same degree of freedom we have today. Recently, as recent as December, there was a critic. She wrote something on Facebook. I mean, she's been a long time critic of the government on Facebook. She's been slapped with 9 year sentence. Is there such a thing happened in America? No. So that is the most recent, December 2021. You do anything, but as long as you do not criticize the policy of government, then you're okay.
And this is a reality. This is a reality in communist dictatorships, and you have more and more Americans, as we've talked about offline in several of our texts and phone conversations, you have more and more younger Americans that are eager to accept socialism and communism. In fact, you had Gloria La Riva in recent years. She is the head of the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which is one of the several of hardline communist groups here in the United States, saying basically the fog of anti-communism is really lifted, particularly with the younger people. They don't remember the Cold War. They weren't born during the Cold War. And so they're not as hostile to communism anymore. And while in this program we're populists, we are for a thoroughgoing reform of capitalism. We don't want to abolish the system of capitalism. We don't want to get rid of basic political freedoms, especially that are not harming the country as a whole. We don't want scientific authoritarianism for this country as populists and civic nationalists on this program. So for those of you who are kind of seduced by the siren songs of authoritarian forms of socialism, buyer beware, or as they say in Latin, caveat emptor. We have people like TQ and others that have been on this program that have provided us the reality of the hellhole, the hellscape of communism compared to most Americans. Sadly, communism and political radicalism is alive and well, and it is growing in adherence. Which brings me to my next point and my next question, TQ. And that is that voices such as yourself, who come from different countries, have really spread the word about the threat of communism, the human rights violations, the national security challenges, and whatnot. Not only have you been very ever present on the front of alerting Americans to the national security dangers of Russia, China, and their allies, such as Vietnam. You've also been on the forefront in being a forceful defender for human rights. And also, you are also, you have a lot to say regarding immigration policy. And I looked at your platform on your website regarding immigration, and definitely contains a lot of valid points. And many immigrants that I've known, even part of my personal life, as romantic partners, friends, colleagues. They've always bettered themselves. They always utilize the opportunities for education and advancement to further themselves and become part of the fabric of the American national community. I mean, after all, my great-grandparents were immigrants from Ukraine, Russia, and Moldova, what is currently called Moldova. So we are, in a sense, a nation of immigrants. I know that's kind of a cliched point. What I find with the issue of immigration is it's politicized on both sides, that there's really no middle ground of discussion on issues like immigration, which is a hot button issue. And it's always, there's a lot of emotion, but there is not enough, okay, here's what we need to do to actually integrate immigrants into the American national community. Could you give us a summary of your platform on immigration, since that's a very important issue to you and the campaign?
Thank you for that question. Yes, immigration reform is something very important for me because, first of all, I have been an immigrant before I became a U.S. citizen. But to make people American to understand why immigration is so important, let's look at our Social Security. We need people to contribute to that funds. I know a lot of elderly people who are not very well exposed to the immigrant communities. I understand there's a distance between those two groups, but if we have more people paying tax, that will contribute to our Social Security, and that is where benefit the elderly at first. So we need immigration regardless in general. Now, of course, when we talk about immigration, there's a legal and illegal immigration. And right now, there are roughly estimated 11 million illegal immigrants in the US. The Republicans have tried think that, well, we should deport them because they came here illegally. And I challenge them, do we have the money to do that? We don't. We're simply going to bankrupt this country if we go that path. Imagine it takes how many cops to spot one illegal immigrant, to help, to put that person in jail, we're waiting for processing paper to send him home, and the plane ticket to send him home. That is just for one person. Multiply whatever that costs by 11 million. You know how much it's going to go. As a human rights activist, I do not want to see family, separation and deportation in that way. Now go back to the other end. They seem to favor to allow those people to become U.S. citizens, and I think that is wrong too, because by allowing illegal immigrants to have quick access to U.S. citizenship, first of all, that will encourage more illegal immigrants. They'll come in, hey, come in, we're going to become U.S. citizens. And that is unfair for people who are with good faith try to apply through the legal process. So my proposal is to, first of all, we need to secure the border. But where do we get the money? Trump tried to secure the border. He couldn't make it. He didn't have the money. He tried to, to move some money from DOD, but that's not the proper way of doing it. We should look for the solution from those immigrants themselves. So I would propose to give them a 3-year work permit for those illegal immigrants. They have to work, they come and register, they pay tax like anyone else, like you, like me. They have to also pay a penalty. I give them 3 years to pay the penalty of $3,000. That is the amount I come up with. It could be, subject to debate or, but with that money during those 3 years, my rough calculation will turn out to be 25 billion. We have to build a wall. I'm not suggesting we have to build a wall. But Trump was asking for 7 or 8 billion. We can have 1/3 of that contribute to secure our border at a much lower cost, because building the wall, I don't think it's a smart way. There's many other ways these days. So 1/3 can be dedicated to secure the border. 1/3 will go, would go and put more people, border patrol, more immigration staff, so we can process the backlog that have been multi-years. Imagine someone want to apply to come to the US and they say, I gotta wait 5 years. I gotta wait more than that. I might as well jump in to be an illegal immigrant. So we need to discourage them by having the process faster. And the other chunk of that money, we can pay for the benefit of the children of the illegal immigrants that today you, me, all the taxpayer are paying, but not the illegal immigrant. That is so unfair. So within 3 years, I can accomplish securing the border, make them pay for their children benefit, and they have to pay, and also having more people to process legal immigration. And after those 3 years, we certainly have a pool of additional work of taxpayer who are going to help paying and share all the burden of Social Security, all the tax that all Americans are paying. That's why a lot of people are asking me, "Oh, why are you favor immigrants? Why you are not, concerned about American?" I said, "No, it is this by gradually integrate them into our society, they will come and help paying to social security. They will help sharing our tax burden. This directly impact on American life. But don't think when we talk about immigrant, it has nothing to do with American. It does directly. Already they had to pay, for their children benefit. That we are paying today. So that is how I believe my approach is in the middle. It's fair. It's produce revenue for the country, and alleviate the tax burden of Americans.
No, and that sounds very interesting. On this program, we're not against immigration or immigrants because they're from foreign countries. I mean, anybody who knows me personally outside of politics knows that all too well. But I do have a concern, and one of the concerns that I do have is about immigration, is the exploitation of both documented and undocumented immigrants, even here in Florida, in agricultural labor, other businesses, the exploitation of H-1B and L-1 workers and H-2 workers, where they are treated as slaves now, or near slaves, where they're underpaid compared to American workers. They have no right to protest their conditions. Otherwise, they're threatened with deportation. Now, not only as a civic nationalist, I call myself a radical civic nationalist, is that wrong because it hurts American workers and American professionals, but morally speaking, I mean, I don't like powerful people bullying people who are weak. That really just frankly ticks me off and gets under my skin. And I've had the opportunity to meet people from other countries who are immigrants. These are hardworking individuals. They're people like you and I with families. They have goals. Most of them are not subversives or national security threats or criminals or whatnot. The individuals, even in my life, that I had partnerships with romantically and currently, one who I'm seeing for months now, they're all good people with families and whatnot. And I can't imagine somebody more powerful exploiting them and treating them like garbage in the workforce. That bothers me. And when people think immigration, they automatically have these red flags saying, oh my God, these people are going to undercut American wages. Well, I say, let's redirect the anger and attention to the powerful individuals that are exploiting them. How would you address the concerns about the exploitation of documented and undocumented immigrant workers?
Thank you. Now you put another hat, which is I haven't put it yet, a hat of human rights activist. I'm very concerned about that as well, and that's why currently for the illegal immigrant, they're working. But how the hell do we know how much do they get paid? Do they get paid the minimum wages? Are they being abused by their employer one way or the other? Or some of them might be even involved sexually, exploitation. So by allowing them a temp work permit, so they are not in the position they can choose if they don't like this employer. Hey, I can go and work for another employer because they are temporarily legal to work. They don't get the right to live in here yet, but that allows them a legal paper, so they will not be afraid of their current employer. Now, let's talk about Florida specifically. I invite everyone, Floridians, go to Disney. How many lawn mower and cutting grass and things like that? How many of them are illegal? Just go and estimate or ask and check them out. How many construction workers who have to paint their stone that you're doing all the construct, on the paving, all the work on the highway that we're doing? How many of them are illegal? Or if tourists coming here in hotel, how many people who do your room, I mean the chambermaid, how many of them are illegal? They are not really stealing the job of Americans, especially in Florida. I can know very well. They are doing the work that most Americans do not want to do. So they are not stealing our job. The only difference is that if we turn them into, taxpayer, they still do the work, but now we get the tax paying to share our tax burden, and we don't have to separate their family, and we don't have to do anything that, because remember when we separate their family, deport them, we create a social impact, instability in our society. That is not good. It's not good. And by the way, by having them register with us, and I am not too idealistic to think all immigrants are good. Okay, I hope they will, but I know some of them, maybe a very small number of them, might turn out to be bad elements. But now I know where you are. You register with me. If you turn out criminal, sir, ma'am, I got you. I send you home. I want to deport you to where you come from. So yes, my policy will deal with both the people who come here with good faith and have a way to address those who try to exploit the system and try to come here to be a criminal.
Okay, good deal. Good deal. Now, my last question before you give out information about your website and your campaign. The last question is that one of the reasons why is, because you wrote it, one of the reasons why you're running, as you said, is because you want to overcome the political divide, and you feel quite correctly that true independents don't have a voice here in Florida politics. The Florida politics is very hyperpartisan, as both of us know. Hyperpartisan establishment, Biden-type Democrats, hyper Reaganite, pro-big business, employer is always right, Republican Party here. And in this state, from my standpoint, populists like myself are sorely not only underrepresented, but unrepresented. And as you pointed out, because I think independents comprise, I think, a slim majority of Florida voters, followed by Democrats and Republican voters neck and neck statewide. What would you do to appeal to independents in Florida, populists who are concerned about the working man, and then try and somehow balance it off with appealing to Republicans and Democrats? How are you going to make that work? That's a tough task.
Thank you. That is a very tough task. And I never like to do something easily in my life. I can share one thing. When I first came to college, I didn't speak a word of English. Well, I knew how to say thank you and hello, and that's about it. I had my cousin register for me because I was unable to speak to the counselor to admit me. When I was in Vietnam, I made a dream. I said I had a dream to travel around the world. As I just mentioned to you earlier, in the country when you move from one city, not even a city, one town to the neighboring town to see your family to stay over, you need a permit. At that time, if someone, when I said I had a dream to travel around the world, they would thought you were idiot, you were crazy. I made it. I made it only within 12 years. Well, from the time I made that assertion when I was living in Vietnam, it is the will. So yes, it is a gigantic order. It's a very tall order, but I'm not deterred. Now let's give our viewer a perspective. I spoke to a lot of people recently. I was in Jacksonville, San Augustine, around that area last week. I spoke to people. They said, you know what? Florida is a red state. I said, well, okay, do you know what is the percentage of Republicans in here? Well, he said, well, about 70%. The other person say, well, 54%. I said, no. Yes, they did came out and vote for Trump, roughly 53, 54%. But in fact, there are 36.5% of registered Republicans. There are 36% of registered Democrats, and there are 27% of registered NPA, which in non-party affiliation, and that percentage has been growing. Back in 2012, there was only 20%, and given, as I state in the reason why I'm running, the more we have a partisan fight. I want to have at least two parties to fight. But now we are fighting about something that is not represent the interest of the American people. And this is my message. It's okay to fight, but as we have to put, I agree with you. If populists mean putting the people above all, yes, I'm going with that, but not in the other sense. In the name of populists, we try to attack another American. Then no, that's not how I see populists. Populists mean yes, we have to take into account the will and the voice of the people. And I believe that number. Now I want to point to them that that number is not something not achievable. That 27%. Plus, I believe there is a fraction of moderate Republican, moderate Democrats they have been having enough of that partisan fight. They might believe in my positive message, and they will join my campaign. That's how. Of course, this is my hope. But not only I have numbers to back up. Not that just appeal. And also one more thing. In Florida, we don't have a runner-up. So whoever, let's say hypothetically, I get 34%, and each side get 33%. I'm still elected senator, as opposed to Georgia. Then someone have to go through, we have to go through the run-up again, a special election again. No, it's not. So take into account those, statistics. I believe we have a good chance. But of course, my difficulty is how to let people know independent is not something bad. It's just, I'm not going there to be against any party. If any side have an agenda that is good for all American people, not just for your party, not just for yourself as an elected official, I would vote yes for that. So you have nothing to lose when you supporting me. Unless you, whoever, think that I just want the peace for my party. I ignore the rest of the party, the rest of the country. Then I have a problem with that. And no, but if you have come and say, why do you think about something good for your party and for the country and for the American people? Yes, you will have my support on that.
Oh, absolutely. Our version of populism, as propounded on this program, speaks more to putting in the American people and our nation's interest above everything else. And we tend to direct our anger to the powerful few that violates and impairs our national security and what I would term shared but earned prosperity. And what we call for is a rebalancing ultimately of interests. And we are for a balance between the needs of the individual and the needs of the national community. It's very important. When it comes to strict social classes, races, religions, we feel and embrace Americans across the divide of good faith and goodwill. So that's how we would describe our populism, if you will, and my radical civic nationalism, that of my co-host who was unable to join us due to work obligations. So, look, you and I can talk about this, a variety of issues all day and all afternoon and all evening. And I think that's one of the things attributes you and I have in common. And we would love to have you back on for a follow-up interview and probably to discuss your stances on geopolitics. Is very thoughtful and very informed. Tell us, please, about where we could reach you. Tell us a little bit about your website, contact information. What is some information for the potential voters here in Florida? How could people contribute and all the rest of it?
Thank you for that. My website is letsbe-american.com. And I want to say a few words about this URL. Not unlike the other people, I or my social media to be OTQ for Senate or for Conquest or whatever. It's a letsbeamerican.com. Because with this campaign, I would like to send a message to remind ourselves that we are all first and foremost Americans. Before we are Democrats, Republican, Independent, before we are Black, White, Hispanic, Asian, or whatsoever, we are first and foremost American. With that in mind, with that mindset, we can surely overcome any obstacle that facing a land, whether it's geopolitics, foreign policy, immigration, job, or anything. As long as we keep our energy, we preserve it, and we do something good for the people, for the country. We should not do anything harmful to the country or to any other American. We're gonna make it happen. So that's why I chose it to be Let's Be American. And once again, let's be American.com.
2 thumbs up for that. 2 thumbs up, brother. Thank you so much, TQ, for appearing on this show. As I mentioned, I would love to have you on future episodes, particularly to comment on current events. I think you're, as I said, very thoughtful. I think you speak very well to the issues. Your heart is in the right place. I mean, we can't endorse candidates formally on this program per se, but let me tell you, your candidacy definitely gives me hope for the future of Florida politics. And on that note, I say God bless you. God bless America. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the weekend. It's beautiful weather down here in South Florida, here in Coral Springs. I'm eager to take advantage of it. Any parting words before we go?
That's all. Thank you for having me. And as I just came out from the church, I would like to share, not from today's gospel, but one sentence that always go in line with me in this campaign. From Luke, I believe. Any kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and a house divided against itself will fall. That's the part note that I want to leave to all the viewer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, TQ. God bless.